Found a cookie up here. You want it?
It's the medical
Yeah. Before we get started today, I want to share just something I've been feeling. It's interesting when you look out on everybody. You can see different expressions. You can see people following. You could see, people struggling with ideas or. But one of the things I've seen that I just want to encourage us in this morning. Sometimes when we enter into difficult topics, and not controversial topics, but when we're really pushing and we're asking you to go deep and asking tough questions about where do you see God's power and what has changed that you need to make in your life, sometimes I can see and I can feel this struggle and this tension and this idea where I feel like sometimes we get right on that borderline to say, yeah, I hear this. And I feel this, and I know Paul's directing us there, and I know it's scripture, but I just don't know. I don't know what this is supposed to look like. I don't know if this can really happen. And I want you to know this morning that our God is a powerful God. And our God is a mighty God. In those areas and those moments where you find yourself kind of at this crossroads or at this tension or where you feel this inward struggle where you say, yes, I believe this, but I just don't see it happening. I want you to feel and know that our God is a mighty and powerful God. So today, as we go through this message, as you move on from this place, as we talk about things that are difficult or things that we continue on through this series, I want us to walk and believe and sit in this power this morning. To know that because of God's power, a lot of things are possible. Because of God's power, pain changes, our problems can change, our past doesn't have this control of us anymore. And before we even start today, I want us to know that, and I want us to walk in that. There's this quote I found the other week, sitting in our kind of sitting room area in our house, and I was reading a book, and the opening line, the opening statement to this chapter was powerful. I had to put the book down. The first time I put that book down. It's really hard to put it down. He opens up this new chapter with this line. He says, change is inevitable, but growth is optional. In that one sentence, I believe the author, David Chang, one of my favorite authors, he's only written 2 books, but I've read one, so he's one of my favorite authors now. He captures a powerful reality in the quote. The reality that the world around us is constantly changing, isn't it? Despite our best efforts, despite our comfort level, despite what we want to happen, the world always changes around us. So change is inevitable. It's going to happen. And a lot has changed in the past 2 years, hasn't it? Because of this little tiny thing behind me, the reality of wherever you land on this spectrum, okay, of belief or understanding or practice, you would all have to agree that COVID-19 changed a lot of things in the past 2 years. I mean, it changed the seating layout in this room. It changed these things that we all have hanging somewhere in our cars called masks now, right? Or they're just reserved for surgeons or medical staff or for outbreaks. But that has changed a lot in this world. In the past 2 years, it hasn't just been that, but the events surrounding the election, wherever you land on either side of that. Politically, there's been a lot of change. Socially, there's been a lot of change in the past 2 years. Issues that were kind of quiet, in the different corners, now they're the forefront, right? Issues of justice or racism or different things like that. Now, you can't walk a day without a conversation that you hear or that you see about those things. A lot has changed. That outrage seems to be the most popular response to everything. That if you're not vehemently against or opposed, or you don't speak against something, then automatically, in some circles, you are a part of the problem. A lot has changed, right? And I don't know about you, but I'm still processing parts of 2020, and it's almost 2022, and change is inevitable. Even in the past 2 years, just me personally, if we zoom in a little bit closer beyond just these big talking points, 2 years ago, I got it all clear from my rare form of skin cancer. I lost my dad the January following. We're expecting in next January or February, we'll have a new baby. Change is inevitable, right? It happens. Whether you want it to, whether you agree with it, whether you think it should change is inevitable. But the second part is powerful because he says, but growth is optional. I asked you in the morning, one of the reflection was, what has changed in your life in the past 2 years? And if you interacted with that question, you probably came up with an answer, right? Something has changed in your life in the past 2 years. But I want to ask you a slightly different question. Beyond what has changed in the past 2 years, how have you grown in the past 2 years? You see, that's a little bit different because now we're not just talking about these topics up here, right? Like, I have a different job. I painted my house. Somebody got sick. My job shifted. You're not talking about that. I'm asking you how you have grown in the past 2 years. Change is inevitable. Growth is optional. I think Paul hits on this. Because the world of the people that Paul has written this letter to, the world of the people that are reading or hearing this letter in their groups was constantly in change. Socially, economically, politically, in the religious and spiritual sphere, it ebbed and flowed depending on their geographical location and who was in power at the time. So if your country was overtaken by a country more powerful, all of a sudden, your economic structure changed, your religious structure changed, your day-to-day life probably changed. So Paul is writing this to groups of people in different areas where their world is constantly changing around them, and not always for the better. It was in constant ebb and flow. And I also want us to realize that back in those days, back when Paul is writing this letter, if you accepted Christ, your life on an individual level changed as well, because it had the potential to alienate you from your family. It had the potential to alienate you from everybody in your town, in your community, because now you weren't going along with the program. Now you started to become part of the problem. So Paul is writing to these groups of people that their world on a large scale and their world on the individual scale was constantly changing, because change is inevitable. But growth is optional. For the first time, as we enter into chapter 4, for the first time, Paul now asks his readers and his listeners to do something. This is the first time in this entire letter where Paul has moved from this idea of here is what God has done. In the next 3 chapters, what we're going to see is, now here's what I want you to do in response to that. And one of the first things that we see Paul talking about as we enter into chapter 4 is that he wants them to grow. Because their lives have changed when they accepted Christ. The world around them is constantly changing, but Paul doesn't want it to stop there. He wants them to grow. So I want to read portions of this chapter together, and we're going to begin in chapter 4, verse 1. So if you haven't made your way there, please do so now. If you don't have access to a Bible on your phone or in front of you, we encourage you to do that. Because here's how Paul starts his letter. And this is the idea of growth that we get in. He starts this chapter, Ephesians chapter 4, verse 1. Here's what Paul writes. He says, as a prisoner of Christ, therefore, or as a prisoner for the Lord, I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling that you have received. This transition where Paul says, now listen, here is my story. And here's what I pray for you. And now that I have stepped into this reality of walking in and living out the things that God has designed and desired for my life, I said, yes, I urge you. And the word urge is kind of like this soft parental encourage. I exhort you. I encourage you. Picture somebody sitting down that has this ability to speak deeply into your life, and they're talking in a soft tone that just breaks down all the layers of hostility and barriers of, are they being mean to me? What do they expect from me? And he says, I want you to live a life worthy of this beautiful thing that you have received from God. I want you to walk in these ways. I want you to center your entire life around what God has designed and desired your life to be. See, he's calling us to move outward. He's calling us to embrace this movement and go outward with the work that God has done through Christ in our hearts and in our lives. Another way of saying this is, I think Paul is encouraging them to say, listen, I don't want you just to be spiritual consumers. Part of this is you being a spiritual contributor. I don't want you to just get in this place where you're constantly just taking this in and saying, yes, it's all about me, and I'm becoming a better person, and I'm walking in this way, and that's great. But Paul says part of your movement isn't just the inside work that Christ is doing because he's powerful. It's moving outward in that same reality. It's moving outward in response to the work that Christ has done in our lives and in the world. Let's continue reading. We're going to read verses 2 through 13. I'm going to just read them. I'm going to bring my Bible closer. 15 years ago, this was the perfect size print. So what does this growth look like? He says this. He says, I want you to be completely humble and gentle. Be patient, bearing with one another in love. Make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. There is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to one hope when you were called, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all. You see, one of the first areas that Paul wants us to grow in is he wants us to grow together. He says part of this isn't just you as an individual, it's what you do with the other people around you. Be completely humble and gentle. Be patient and bearing in one another in love. Make every effort. I think Paul later says in Romans, right, as far as it is dependent upon you, do everything possible to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. You know, we began talking about this idea of power. And then after talking about those two things of unity, Paul talks about this one thing, right? He says there's one body and one Spirit. You were called in one hope when you were called, one Lord, one faith, one baptism. There's this powerful idea that Paul talked about a little bit earlier. And I want us to understand that the power of God is not limited to one specific group of people. The power of God wasn't just limited to the Jewish people in that area or in the place or whenever the letter was written or wherever the letter was read. The power of God wasn't limited to the past of whoever was listening to this letter. The power of God wasn't limited to people's perceptions of the audience of this letter. So what Paul is essentially saying is saying the work of God is powerful enough that it breaks down barriers. Remember the earlier chapters where he said this wall of hostility that separated different groups of people physically? This wall of hostility that said, I have access to God, but because of who you are or who you're not, or what you've done or what you have not done, you don't have access to God. The power of Christ, that wall has been broken down. And more than likely, the audience of this letter is from different backgrounds, different social statuses, different races and ethnicities. They have different positions in the community, and believe it or not, they probably all have different political views. And what Paul is saying is when you grow together, you should be humble and gentle, and you should make every effort to live at peace with one another through the bond of the Spirit, because the Spirit is the one that has done the work. And it's done it in you as much as it's done it to me, as much as it's done to the person across the street. There is this bond, and he's calling us to grow together, but he's focusing us on one thing, that is the person and the work of Christ. You were called to one hope. You don't have different hopes because of your backgrounds. You don't have different hopes because of what you can afford. You don't have different hopes because of your stories. You have one faith, one baptism, one Lord, one Father who is in all and through all and above all. This is where I want you to focus on. Regardless of your backgrounds, regardless of your stories, regardless of all of these things, I want you to grow together. And listen to what he says in verse 7. But to each one of us, grace has been given as Christ appointed us. A little bit later on in verse 9, he says, he who descended, and he was talking about Christ coming into earth, is the very one who ascended higher than the heavens in order to fill the whole universe. Probably means there's going to be some people who don't look like me, don't think like me, don't talk like me. It was him who gave some to be apostles, some to be prophets, some to be evangelists, and some to be pastors and teachers, to prepare God's people for the works of service so that the body of Christ may be built up until we all reach unity in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God and become mature, growing up, attaining or getting or striving to get the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. Be kind to one another. Make peace with one another. Because there is one God who acted through his Son, and he has gifted and called each and every single one of us to do something different in this world. But in those verses, there's this powerful idea that we need to grow together. Because without other people, Paul is presenting this idea that we as a body and we as individuals will never be able to achieve what God has designed and desired us to do. Without individuals walking in God's designs and desires, without individuals saying yes to God, taking the first step, believing that God has power over their past and power over their identity, without people saying yes to those things and being united in that area, we may never reach the fullness that God has designed for us. It's like driving around with our gas tank perpetually at a quarter of a tank. Now, how far can you go in a quarter tank of gas? Depends on your car, right? Depends on how you drive. Some of you, it's scary how short that distance is. But what if you were meant to go beyond the destination of just that quarter tank of gas? I think that's part of what Paul is talking about. We all work together to help each other get to the destination we are designed to do. I can probably do some things by myself, just like that quarter tank of gas. I can get to certain areas, can't I? But what if that's not the only places I'm designed to go? What if through other people I can be filled and fed in a way that I can reach so many different areas and do so many more things? See, I think this is what Paul is alluding to. We need to do it together. That's what he says in verse 13. Until we all reach unity in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God and become what? Become mature, growing up, or mature, however you want to say it. Attaining, getting, grasping, holding, achieving the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. See, not only does Paul talk about growth and growing together, that we need to do this, these different gifts are meant to equip and build and expand, but he also, implicit in all of these other verses, is growing up. See, change is inevitable, but growth is optional. Paul says, I want you to grow together. This beautiful, diverse group of people from different backgrounds, different pasts, different stories, different potentials, all resting in the power of God, working together in a unity, being patient and humble with one another, working towards peace with one another, in this idea of becoming united in their pursuit of what God has designed and desired them to do. But he also shares this idea that beyond growing together, he wants us to grow up. To grow into what Christ has done for us. We see this, right? We see this in the verse we just read. He says, until and become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. A little bit later on in verse 15, he says this. He says, instead, when we speak the truth in love to one another, we will in all things do what? Grow up into him who is the head, and that is Christ. Growth is optional, but Paul says you need to grow together and you need to become mature. You need to grow up. Paul uses this idea that when you grow up, you can gain more, you can obtain the whole measure when you can grow up into Christ. And he continues this idea as we go on through verse 17. He challenges us in verses 17 through 19 about who we pattern our lives on. Let's just read it together. So I tell you this, and insist on it in the Lord, that you must no longer live as the Gentiles do, in the futility of their thinking. They are darkened in their understanding and separated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them due to the hardening of their hearts. Having lost all sensitivity, they have given themselves over to sensuality so as to indulge in every kind of impurity with a continual lust for more. Paul was doing really good. He had me. I was his number one fan. I retweeted a lot of his posts from that early part of that chapter, right? Liked them, screenshotted them, posted them on my social media because this guy is awesome. I like what he's talking about. And then he says, I am darkened in my understanding. He had me. Now he's lost me. Because now he's getting personal, isn't he? He says, I tell you, and I insist on this. Essentially, what Paul is saying is, I don't want you to live in the old patterns of your life. I don't want you to walk around with this darkness of understanding. I don't want you to walk around with this continual lust for more. I don't want you to walk around with a heart that has been hardened to what I'm trying to do in your life and in the world. You know why? Because that's not who you are. That's why Paul started this letter by calling us saints. And then as he continued this letter, he says, listen, the reason you are who you are is because what God has done. He is a God whose default position is to lean towards us and pursue us in love. And he designed us, and he cares for us, and he has purposes for us, and he's revealed himself to us. And Paul says, this is who you are now. The reason Paul puts this in there is because he doesn't want people to go back to the patterns of their life that are not being redeemed or restored or renewed by the power of God. Because there's a group of people walking around thinking the same way and living the same way and chasing all of these same things. And Paul says that's not the power that God has given you. That's not who you are anymore. And that's another reason why we need one another. We need one another to continue to confirm our identity in Christ. Not to judge one another necessarily, but to say, hey, listen, this isn't who you are. You're not powerless in this situation. You're not a prisoner of that. You need to look at your life through the lens of redemption and restoration and renewal. Because this is what he says in verse 20. He says, you, however, you didn't come to know Christ that way. You didn't come to know a God who is powerless over your pain. You didn't come to know a God who is powerless over your past. You didn't come to know a God who says God's power is not bigger than your problems. That's not the God who you grew up knowing, because you were preached and taught a God in truth. Surely you heard of him and were taught in him in verse 21, in accordance with the truth that is in Jesus. You were taught in regard to your former way of life to put off your old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires. And you were taught in verse 23 to be made new in the attitude of your minds. In verse 24, and to put on the new self, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. See, this old self, this old way of thinking, this old way of living, this old heart which is scarred and hardened to what God is trying to do in the world, you were told to discard that, to throw it away, to get rid of it. And you were taught the truth in Jesus that now you actually have the power to do so. If God the Father has enough power to raise Christ from the grave, I have enough power to be risen above being a prisoner of my past. If God the Father has enough power to raise Christ from the grave, and that power lives inside of me, which he talked about earlier in this letter, then there is a power that I have that allows me to ascend or transcend or stand above just this reality of pain and problems and other people's perceptions of me. You know, later on in that same book, which that beautiful quote is, the way he illustrates this principle of change is inevitable, but growth is optional, is through lobsters. Okay? Some of you are using the Friends reference right now in your head, you know. He's your lobster. Anybody? No? Okay, 5 of you. That's great. If 5 was a generous preacher count, there was really 1 of you who knew what that was. Okay, so this is a lobster. Now lobsters grow through a process called molting. Okay, it's this process where they actually shed their old little shells, and they grow into new ones. Okay, now there are no good pictures of molting. It is alien-like. It is disgusting looking. So I decided not to put that out there this morning. Okay. Now, the interesting part is nobody really knows how old lobsters can get. There's kind of a guess that the maximum age they kind of put it around is this idea of 100 to 120 years old. Okay? It's an old lobster, right? But in order to grow, they have to shed their old shell. And it's a painfully excruciating, tedious process, okay? I watched a time lapse of it. It's weird, but I was committed. Okay, one of those things you're like, I'm going to watch this, and I don't know why I'm still watching this, but I am. It's a painful process. It's a very difficult process. There's nothing about it that's easy whatsoever. It actually leaves them in an extremely vulnerable state, right? Because they had this hard outer shell to protect them from the things around them. But when they shed and they molt, they no longer have that. But here's what happens. Every time that they molt or they shed this outer shell, they grow anywhere between 15 to 40% of their body weight from which they first started. When they shed this old shell, they actually grow by absorbing the water around them, which they couldn't gain access to because their shell was around them. Now, I don't know what you think about lobsters, but this illustration was powerful. Because this, I think, is exactly what Paul is talking and challenging the people to do in their growth. He says, you have a shell. Okay, this isn't going to be a perfect connection, but just roll with it. We're committed now, okay? You have a way that you're used to doing things in the world. You have a pattern of thinking. You have a pattern the way you view things. You have a pattern of how you respond to things. And part of that has been shaped by the world around you. Part of that has been shaped by pain. Part of that has been shaped by your past. Part of that has been shaped by your problems and other people's perceptions of you. But that, if you leave it there, is going to limit your growth. That is going to keep you the same size in the same place that you were before. But what Paul is advocating here is this idea that you were created and meant for so much more. You were created not to just live in this shell or this outer layer that is shaped by all of these different things. You were meant to take that off, to put off this old self, to discard it. That you can be informed by your past, but you're not meant to live there because that's not who you are anymore. And you're to put on this new self, this new identity. This new identity that's formed by the very power of God. This new identity that's informed and formed by this God who pursues you, who has designed you, who has desired you to do amazing things in this world, that reveals himself to you through Christ. You're supposed to put that on daily. To go through this process of growing to where we can stop and pause and look at ourselves and say, listen, maybe this isn't who I'm supposed to be. And this is really tough because I think what Paul is rebelling against is this idea that we can merely change a few outward habits. That people just hang around with a different group and people just have a different schedule on Sundays. I think he's pushing back against that. And he says, listen, you're not meant to just change some things. You're actually meant to grow. You're meant to grow up into this maturity of Christ. And that means we're going to have to shed some of the old thoughts and the old ideas and the old patterns and the old ways of thinking because we have been renewed by Christ. One of the scariest things that I read in a book was a book by John Ortberg. And he said, I grew up with this kind of superhero in my faith. This person I looked up to. If there was a Christian man I wanted to be, it was this man. And then there's a stage in life where our heroes become mortal, right? We begin to see some of their flaws, and not everybody's perfect, or not everybody's a superhero. We begin to see that it's more than just childlike adoration. And he talks about the process to say, I don't think I've seen this person change in the past 30 years. But he's been a Christian the entire time. He walks around saying, well, that's just who I am. But that's thinking of yourself in that old shell. I don't know why I do this when I talk about the lobster shells, okay? But he was meant for so much more. He said, slowly I became sad because his anger was still the same 15 years later. His impatience with his children was still the same 15 years later. His backbiting tone with his significant other was the same 15 years later. But he changed. He got saved by Christ. But he didn't really grow. Change is inevitable, right? But growth is optional. God has given us the power, not just to change, but the power to grow. He has called us not just to change what we do on Sunday mornings, not to change the groups of people that we hang around with, not to just change our vocabulary and get rid of all the curse words. That's what I thought it was for the first 3 months. I go to my pastor, I stopped cursing. It's like, that's great. Why you changed outward things. And for me, that was a huge thing, right? That was a huge area of growth. If I were to ask you the question, oh, hold on. All throughout this chapter, Paul shares this idea that what God has done for us is for us. It's designed for us to grow up and to grow together. And we're not meant to be trapped in our former identities. We're not meant to be trapped in these former versions of ourselves. God is more powerful than our past. God is more powerful than our pain and our problems and our perceptions of others. And when we don't change, we walk around limited by those things. Just like the lobster, if it doesn't molt, it's going to forever stay that same size. They say that, lobsters stop growing when they stop molting. That's the best science can give us. They can't give us an age. They say, when it stops molting, it's probably going to stop growing. And it's probably not going to live very much longer after that. So a question I have for you as we kind of end our time. Is where do you need to grow? You're here. Most of you probably have, and I'm not saying this in a bad way, it's just because I don't know all of your stories deeply and personally. Most of you probably think that, you're coming to the intersection here where you're asking, what does God have to say about my life and what I'm doing right now? You're at least curious enough to be in that place. Some of you are veterans. You've been in the game for a very long time. Church has been a part of your life. God has been a part of your life. But where do you need to grow? Because the trajectory that Paul puts us on, it isn't just one of this new thing called the church. It's this idea that we grow up into Christ, that we become more and more like Him. That patience. A little bit later on, he says it talks about forgiving one another. Forgiveness, mercy, patience, kindness, joy. All of these things should be growing in our life. That nobody should be able to look at us and say, you're the same person you were 15 years ago. Because we have a powerful God, right? Spirit is active and alive. The Word is capable of changing us and forming us and doing all of these power things. So where do you need to grow? What is that? Maybe it's an area of pain where you need to invite God into and start the process of allowing His power to transform things. Maybe you're stuck in this old shell of people's perceptions about you. And you need to begin a conversation that allows God's power to begin the process of transforming that into something new. But just like the lobster, you're going to have to shed some things and become vulnerable so that you can grow. So what is that for you? Maybe it's the thing that you've struggled with for years, and it's never changed. The second question is related. What is something that God desires you to do? Not the old version of yourself. What is something that God desires you to do? What is something that God has designed you to do? Where is He leading you to go? Who is He leading you to become? How is He leading you to grow? I'm going to pray. And I'm going to ask that after I pray, you just reflect on those questions. And after a moment of reflection, we're going to enter into a time of communion. So I'm just going to invite you to pray with me now. Father, we are thankful that you meet us exactly where we are at. We're thankful, Father, for your Son, Jesus. We're thankful that you sent him here to earth and that he was an exact representation of your love and your power and your grace and your forgiveness and your mercy. And we're thankful, Father, because of him choosing to be obedient to your mission and saying yes to the cross. That you allow us, by your grace, to have the power to become something different. You give us the power to not be trapped. Have the power and victory over darkness in our lives. And we have the power during the process of maturing and growing up and becoming more like your Son. Father, I ask. I ask that whatever you reveal to us as the area of growth that we need, or that you're calling us to, or that you have designed us to have, or desire us to have, whatever that is, for every single individual that hears these words, I pray that they would view that through the lens and through the reality and through the truth of your power. That today, whatever you are leading us to change, wherever you're leading us to grow, that, Father, we may do so in the power that you have displayed through your Son, Jesus Christ, and his resurrection. That we may walk through that process, whatever that means and whatever that looks like, through the power of your Son, Jesus. So, Father, just be with us now. Be with us now as we enter into a space of reflection. I ask this all in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen.